Hey students, it's Dr. Ways and welcome to your lecture on the bones of the skull. So there are 22 individual bones in the skull and in the face, and we separate them. The bones of the skull would be those considered back here, and the bones of the face would be those considered up here. And as you can see, they are all sutured together, and this is the blown apart version of what they look like. And of course, in a real skeleton and in the lab, you're not going to have colored skeletons. So they're all going to be a similar color. So what we're going to do is work our way through them and find out how best to talk about them and what the different parts are. So for each set of bones and parts of bones of the skull and face that we're going to talk about, I'm going to have it from a different view, and we're going to do it per bone. All right, and the order that it goes in follows along in the same order that your structure list for the lab goes. So the occipital bone being the first bone that's covered, number 1 would be the first part of the bone that's under the occipital bone. And then it goes from there. So with the occipital bone, notice that I have, well, 1, the numbering, and 2, I've highlighted in gray here the ones that I want you to know or that are best seen from this view. So I'm not going to go over all of the bones because that would be just really boring. So I'll just point out certain features as we go along and things in relation to one another. So what I'll mention here is that with the occipital condyles, remember the occipital condyles on either side of the foramen magnum, which is what the spinal cord goes through, is where the skull sits on the atlas. All right, and as it sits on the atlas, it's going to rock back and forth along these condyles, giving us that back and forth motion when we shake or nod our heads yes. And remember also that external occipital protuberance is a spot where the nuchal ligament that runs along the spine of each vertebrae attaches to on the skull. All right, and this is looking from the posterior view of the occipital bone, and again we see that external occipital protuberance right here. If we look on the interior of the cranium, we see on the opposite side of the external occipital protuberance the internal occipital protuberance. And of course, I want you to notice that there are ridges or crests that extend from either side of that, which will divide the cranium into different compartments where dura will be attached or sit, and where the components of the brain will sit. All right, so next we'll move on to the parietal bone, looking at a left lateral view. And so this purple area would all be the parietal bone right here. And parietal actually means wall, so think of it as the wall of the skull. Looking from a superior view, what we call the skull cap or the calvaria. So the skull cap, when you usually see skulls in a laboratory and you take off the top, that is the calvaria. And so there are 2 parietal bones, one on each side, left and right, that are connected to each other via a suture, the sagittal suture. Okay, and just anterior to that, we have the frontal bone. So in a frontal view of the skull, the frontal bone has a couple parts. First, it's a squamous part, and the squamous part is that part that extends all the way to where it comes in contact with the suture that connects it to the parietal bones, which is your coronal suture. So that's the squamous part. And then we have 6 and 7 is our supraorbital notch or supraorbital foramen. In some people it's a notch, and some people it's a complete circle, and it's known as a foramen at that point. All right, and those supraorbital notches or foramen are within the orbital margin. So the orbital margin would be right here, or supraorbital margin rather. All right, going back to the lateral view, we have our temporal bone, and our temporal bone is going to be this one in green right here. And there are lots of different parts of the temporal bone, so we'll kind of break that down. 10, the mastoid process. We've talked about that. That's where the sternocleidomastoid is attached to, as well as a couple other muscles that we've gone over, including the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, the splenius capitis, and the longissimus capitis. All right. Number 9 here, we have the external auditory or external acoustic meatus. So that's the hole for where the ear is and where leads into the inner ear. 11 would be the styloid process right here, and we already saw that the stylohyoid is one of the muscles that are attached to that particular structure. And 12, mandibular fossa. So this is the mandible, and this is the mandibular condyle, and the mandibular condyle fits into the mandibular fossa. So you're not going to be able to see it from this point of view. That's why I have the skull over here showing you this point of view. And then we have this zygomatic arch right here, all right, which is 2 parts, and you can see that it's 2 parts because it has a suture right here. Here we have the zygomatic process of the temporal bone because it's a part of the temporal bone that's reaching towards the zygomatic bone. All right, looking inside the skull from a superior view, we can also see the temporal bone right here. So this would be the outline. Notice that it's not the same green color because this is a different picture. And this ridge right here is the petrous part of the temporal bone. Petrous refers to stone-like. So this is a region of the temporal bone in which the inner workings of the ear are located. All right, again, from a superior view inside the skull, we have the sphenoid bone. I don't know what this line here is. It's not pointing to anything. But the sphenoid bone is this whole area in purple right here. So this entire bone that you see right here. And sphenoid actually means wedge. So think of it as the bone that's wedged in the middle of all the other bones of the skull. When we were looking at the occipital bone, I forgot to mention that this area back here where you have these indentations is the posterior cranial fossa. And the part of the skull where the sphenoid bone is, these are indentations as well. It's might be a little hard to see, but that's the middle cranial fossa. And so the sphenoid bone sits within the middle cranial fossa, and it's all of the stuff, all of the parts that are in yellow here. So as it goes out, you know, it's a kind of, to me, it looks like a bat. So here are the ears, and here are the wings, all right? And so these wings up here are the greater wings of the sphenoid, because I'm not the only one that thought it looked like something that flies. And on the next slide, we'll see 16, which is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. All right, sitting here in the middle is the sella turcica, also known as a Turkish saddle. And so that's the area where the hypophysis or the pituitary gland sits. All right, and it's here's the back of it, here's the front. So this is anterior, this is posterior. So the indentation, the seat of the saddle, is known as the hypophyseal fossa because that's where the hypophysis or the pituitary gland sits. And then the back portion is called the dorsum sellae. And if we look at the anterior cranial fossa, which is this indented region at the front of the skull, the posterior border is where you'll find the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. All right, and that's sitting a little bit higher than the rest of the sphenoid bone is, which is why it's part of the anterior cranial fossa instead of the middle cranial fossa. All right, looking at an inferior view of the sphenoid bone, again, a lot of these structures you're going to see from multiple different views. I'm just pointing out a few. The best way that you guys can look at the skull and figure out what the parts are to take a skull in lab and sit down with it and find all the parts, put pieces of tape on it, label it with numbers. That's the best way to study this, and it's really helped undergrads when they do that. So I recommend it for you as well. So again, here is your greater wing of the sphenoid here on either side. And then we jump to 20 because we've already done the ones between there. Down here we have the pterygoid process. All right, on either side, the pterygoid process. And pterygoid is another word that means wing or wing-like. So not only do you have the greater wing and the lesser wing, but you also have the pterygoid process, which is an inferior facing wing of the sphenoid bone. All right, so we have two parts to that pterygoid process. We have the medial plate, which is right here, and then the lateral plate, which is right here. And on this side, medial plate, lateral plate. All right, going back to the anterior cranial fossa, right in the middle here, we have this bone called the ethmoid bone. All right, and the ethmoid bone, you will never in its natural state see the full bone. You only see parts of it. So from the anterior view in the cranial cavity, on right in the middle of either side, the anterior cranial fossa, you will have the crista galli, which means crest of the cock. So you know those roosters have that big red thing on top of their head. This kind of looks like that, so that's why it has its name. And on either side of that, we have the cribriform plate. Cribriform refers to something that's like a sieve or a colander, something you strain things in. And what actually goes through that cribriform plate right here will sit your cranial nerve 1, your olfactory nerves. And little projections will project down through those cribriform plates into the nasal cavity, and that's what allows us to smell. So both of those are part of the ethmoid bone from a superior view. Here's what the ethmoid bone looks like if it is taken out of the skull. All right, so again, here's the crista galli. Down here on either side, you would have the cribriform plate. So this would be an anterior view, as if we're looking directly into the nasal cavity and stripped everything else away. You'll be able to do this on the anatomage table if you want to as well. Within there, we have little parts of bone. You have the superior nasal concha on either side, and you have the middle nasal concha on either side. We'll talk more about the nasal concha when we get to the nasal cavity later on. And then right down the middle, you have this thing called the perpendicular plate, which makes up part of the septum of your nose. That divides it into left and right halves. All right, so here is another view. Here's your superior concha, or middle concha. Down here, you actually have your inferior nasal concha, but they are separate bones. They are not part of the ethmoid bone. So superior and middle, part of the ethmoid. Inferior, not part of the ethmoid. And the other thing you'll notice within the ethmoid bone that's not something you need to identify is there are air cells. So this is a space that we call the ethmoid sinuses. So pockets of non-bony tissue that allow for different functions, one of them being resonance of your voice. And also notice that the lateral borders of the ethmoid bone make up the medial borders of your orbit. All right, moving on to the facial bones. Again, an anterior view. We have the maxilla. So the maxilla is all of this in purple right here. Except for this area right here, those are the nasal bones, which are completely separate. They're a separate bone connected to the maxilla, but not part of the maxilla. All right, and parts that you need to be familiar with, you have your infraorbital foramen, so little holes that are below the orbits. That's what infraorbital means. And through that infraorbital foramen goes one of the branches of the trigeminal nerve. All right, then we have the alveolar processes. All of these would be alveolar processes, and your teeth go into the alveolar processes. So remember from respiratory that the alveoli of the lungs were these grape-like clusters of air. These would be bony clusters of air through which the teeth fit into. And then from an inferior view of the maxilla, we have the palatine process, which forms part of your hard palate, the anterior part of your hard palate. All right, other bones, we have the lacrimal bone, which is this little bone right here in the medial portion of the orbit. And the lacrimal bone is the bone through which the lacrimal duct sits, so that's why it has that name. Then we also have the zygomatic bone, which extends from the frontal bone, connects to the maxilla, and also connects to the temporal bone. And so as it connects to the temporal bone to form this zygomatic arch, we have the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Similar to we had the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, temporal process of zygomatic bone. Both together make up the zygomatic arch, and that is the ridge that goes from your cheek across the lateral portion of your head to your ear. All right, moving on to the mandible, and of course the mandible would be otherwise known as your lower jaw. We've talked about the condylar process, which fits into that mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. At the anterior end of this, okay, this whole part of the mandible is called the ramus. At the anterior end of the ramus, we have the coronoid process, And if you remember, we had another coronoid process in the ulna, so don't get the coronoid process of the mandible mixed up with the coronoid process of the ulna. All right, so here's the ramus, here's another ramus, and then you go around to the body of the mandible, which is the part of the front which makes up your chin. So here is the angle, so where you're going from the ramus to the body, that's the angle of the mandible. Then we have the body, and within the body, first of all, we have these mental foramen, and remember, mental means chin, so they are holes within the chin, and through those holes go the mental nerves, which are distant branches of the cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve. All right, other facial bones include the vomer. So here is the vomer bone right here, and notice that that forms the inferior border of the division between the left and right nasal cavities. So here's your perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, which I said forms the septum. Here is the inferior part of the septum, which is the vomer. That's a completely separate bone. So here's the perpendicular plate right here, and then here would be the vomer right here. And then, of course, on either side, remember we have you can't see the superior nasal concha, but here's the middle. And then down here, you have the inferior nasal concha, like you see right here. And those are completely separate bones from the ethmoid bones. So, again, they are not part of the ethmoid. They are separate bones that are attached to both the maxilla as well as the ethmoid bone. And I forgot to mention one more thing with the previous, with the mandible. You also have alveolar processes that are holding teeth within the mandible as well. All right, going back to the calvaria, making sure we know the bones. So here's our frontal, parietal, and occipital. And the sutures that are holding them together between the frontal and parietal bones would be called the coronal suture. Think of coronal sections. Between the parietal bones, you have the sagittal suture. Again, think of sagittal sections. And at the posterior side that connects the occipital bone to the parietal bones, you have the lambdoid suture. And the lambdoid suture is called the lambdoid suture because it looks like the Greek letter lambda. So imagine that kind of there. So that's called the lambdoid suture. All right, looking from a lateral view, you have the squamous suture right here. And the squamous suture, remember we had the squamous part of the frontal bone? The squamous suture, if you look at it carefully on a real skull, squamous refers to scale-like. So the temporal bone, this part of it, has a scale-like appearance, and so the suture got named the squamous suture instead of this being named the squamous part of the temporal bone. All right, and this slide and the next slide is going to show you all the holes in the skull, all of the foramen that you need to be aware of and what goes through them. So I'm not going to go through them here. I recommend you, we'll go through them a little bit when we do the cranial nerves and other parts, but I recommend going through them and getting to know the different parts of the different holes that are going through the skull so that you can be aware of where they are and what traverses through them and why. So this is a superior view from inside the skull, and this is the inferior view of the skull, where you can see the other side of some of these foramen and the things that will pass through them. So you'll need to know them from both sides. And again, the best way to do this, get into the lab, get a skull, sit down with it, put pipe cleaners through it. In fact, I'll bring some pipe cleaners into the lab so that you can use them. And get to know the different parts in 3D.